Good afternoon. I'm Tasneem Raja, Editor-in-Chief of the Oaklandside, a nonprofit newsroom for Oakland, based in Oakland, and by and for people who love Oakland. We launched this newsroom in June 2020 under circumstances none of us could have imagined in our wildest dreams. I'm honored that you're joining us today, and I hope all week to mark our one-year anniversary with conversations about the power and potential of what local journalism can do for Oakland and diverse communities across our country. For the next half hour or so, we're talking about what equity in journalism means, why it matters, and how local newsrooms like the Oaklandside can move the ball forward. With me are two powerhouse journalists who in many ways need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. Soledad O'Brien is an award-winning and internationally acclaimed journalist, speaker, author of 2 books, and philanthropist who anchors and produces the Hearst Television political magazine program, Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien. She's reported for NBC, MSNBC, and CNN, won 3 Emmys, the George Peabody Award, and too many other awards to name here. She's also the co-founder of the Powerful Foundation, which helps young women get to and through college. On a personal note, I just want to say I deeply appreciated when Soledad last summer amplified the work of our education reporter, Ashley McBride at the Oaklandside, retweeting her phenomenal coverage of a push to remove campus police from Oakland public schools. Thank you, Soledad, for joining us today and lending your voice to this conversation.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
Also with me is Martin G. Reynolds. Martin is a co-executive director of the Robert C. Maynard Institute for Journalism Education, an organization that has long been on the front lines of advocating for and helping to create more diverse newsrooms across the country. Martin began his career right here in Oakland at the Oakland Tribune as a Chip Quinn Scholar in 1995. He was the editor-in-chief of the Oakland Tribune from 2008 to 2011, and I'd like to note the lead editor on the award-winning Chauncey Bailey Project. He's the co-founder of Oakland Voices. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Oakland Voices. It's a community storytelling project that trains residents to serve as community correspondents. And we've been honored at the Oaklandside to collaborate with Oakland Voices on some terrific journalism over the past year. Martin is also a member of the board of the Cityside Journalism Initiative, the parent nonprofit organization that powers Oaklandside. Martin, thank you so much for joining us.
Very glad to be here. Thank you.
So I want to jump in with saying, not everybody might be aware of this, but actually Soledad and Martin have both been involved deeply in local journalism in the East Bay. Soledad is a former East Bay bureau chief for the Bay Area news station KRON, and Martin, of course, as a former EIC of the Oakland Tribune. I'd love to hear from both of you, when you were in those roles and covering Oakland and thinking about the way Oakland is perceived and portrayed in the national media and the national imagination, what was important to both of you for people to get about this city? Soledad, I'd love to hear from you about your experience covering Oakland.
I enjoyed living in Oakland, covering Oakland, and reporting on Oakland for KRON. But if I have to be honest, and I tend to be brutally honest, I think often in pitching our stories, there was, and I was a relatively new reporter, there was sort of a type of story that would come out of Oakland. And it was very hard to sell the opposite of the type. So I covered a lot of crime in Oakland. I covered sort of, basic teacher strike. There was a big teacher strike when I was in Oakland. I worked at KRON from 93 to 96, 97. And it really wasn't until many years later that I fully grasped kind of how it worked, because it was one of the very first newsrooms that I'd worked in as a reporter, not as a producer, as a production assistant. So at a decently high level. And I think like a lot of newsrooms, people, I'll tell you a story and this will illuminate it. One day, one of the bridges must have been closed because people had to drive through Oakland to come into KRON. The main office is in San Francisco, was on Van Ness. It's moved since then. And I remember I was in for a meeting as well. And so this was the morning meeting. And everybody was joking, kind of, sort of, about how they took their lives into their own hands by driving through Oakland. Now, you all know that's the highway, right? So I think it's 5 lanes, maybe 6 lanes, right? So you're not actually driving through Oakland, you're sort of kind of on a highway. And it was kind of the butt of the joke, get it? Like, oh my God, the highway I usually take is closed, but I risked my life and I drove through Oakland, but I made it. And it kind of was the moment, actually, that I decided that I would leave KRON, because people didn't even realize I was the East Bay bureau chief. By the way, I was like the only reporter, so it wasn't, I mean, it sounds amazing, but it was a very tiny job. But no one thought it was weird to sort of mock this idea of people who lived in Oakland, and how, that this idea of Oakland just being dangerous and haha, all you want to do is drive and get through it. And these are all people who are going to the morning meeting. And as you both know, the morning meeting, right, is where you set the agenda of the stories you're going to cover. I lived in Oakland, and I was one of the maybe 2 reporters who were based, covering Oakland. And I just remember thinking, like, it's time to go, because not only was it the butt of the joke, but also nobody was even embarrassed that they were saying it to me, I lived on Mandana Way around Lake Merritt in Oakland, right? Like, it was so overtly absurd that they had to drive through Oakland that it didn't even embarrass them that they were making a joke kind of at my expense. And I think that that's not atypical. I think that this idea of, like, well, Oakland is crime, and Oakland is poverty, and Oakland is all these things. And occasionally we're going to do, look, she's a mom of 10 foster kids, or, oh, community center opening. But, mostly 90% what we all think of Oakland, we being people in the morning meeting, and then the 10% sort of counter, a counter to the narrative, counter narrative. Pretty typical. And so I found that frustrating, and I knew that was not really what I wanted to do. And so I left. So but I say that loving it. I know sometimes it's hard to think like you can love a place and really enjoy your work there, but also recognize that there might be limitations. And I think often newsrooms, for me at least, have had some of those limitations, that they just, the voice of the predominant group in the newsroom is going to push it in a direction. And if you're not that person, then you might not be that comfortable there. Forgive me, it's such a long answer, but I think it's a story worth illuminating my experience.
Soledad, thank you so much for that response. It's certainly one that resonates with me deeply as, the editor-in-chief of a newsroom that every day is making these decisions about, what are we covering, how are we covering it, and what impressions are we giving by the choices that we make. Martin, you were leading the Oakland Tribune several years later in the late 2000s. How did you think about those impressions?
I really appreciate, Soledad, what you said about sort of the butts of these jokes, and working at the Oakland Tribune, because we were at that point we're at a regional news organization. Bay Area News Group was really overseeing a number of newsrooms across the region. And at that time, there were really consolidated copy desks really coming into the fore as well. And so what you often had in those situations were, editors and copy editors and headline writers who might be working in Pleasanton or other places who really didn't have a relationship to the community. And so there was this constant need to sort of reiterate the value and to make sure that the narrative and just the subtle things of like headlines and decks didn't cast the community in a way that felt as though, well, wait a minute, who are these people talking to, right? Because when you have sort of this consolidated production, what ends up happening is that the way in which things are presented is not of the community, right? So very different than like the Oakland side, which is very of the community, about the community. It feels very much like you are speaking to your folks. In that situation, there was often a constant battle. In large part because of the production and the way news were made, to make sure that narrative came through. I think we did a good job of that. And then there were times when copy desks were actually relocated back into the newsroom. And people don't know that, right? So there is this thing about how, people make assumptions about how the decisions that we make and what must they be thinking. And there's such a lack of transparency often. And so I think for me, what really stands out about that time is that there was still that narrative of Oakland as dangerous, Oakland as menacing, Oakland as all of these places. That's part of the reason why we started Oakland Voices, was to really reframe the narrative around this community, that there's actually so much more nuance and so much more context. And it's actually, I'll tell a quick story too. We had gotten a grant to do stories about sort of the impact of trauma on the community. And what we wanted to do, we got the zip code of one of the most quote unquote violent parts of the city. But what we wanted to do was go actually embed a reporter there for 30 days to live in this community to actually tell a different story. And so, and the goal being like, what is this? So this is what you hear about, the larger narrative, but what's actually this neighborhood really about? And so we had a reporter go live in this community or live in this particular neighborhood, but we wanted to do a piece articulating and letting folks know that we were doing this. So it was a long piece. This is where we're going to do it. This is the zip code where he is. And the headline ended up being 30 Days in the Belly of the Beast, which, so here we are trying to do a story about how this community might seem violent, but in fact, it's not that. And then the headline was the very thing that we were trying to not do. And so this journalist was there, wrote about this level of pride and this one diner in the community where everybody went, and this level of sort of a doctor who took care of folks and wouldn't necessarily charge them, a vet who was in the community, just all this context and nuance about what this neighborhood that is quote unquote violent was all about, when in fact it was vibrant. People had pride. They loved the community, they loved the neighborhood. They didn't turn away from the challenges that were there, and they were real and they were significant. But it was sort of, it was a real opportunity to tell a different side of what Oakland is about. And that's what I really endeavored to do as editor of the newspaper.
Often when I would speeches, I would tell people, you know, if you allow other people to tell your story, there's a pretty good chance that you're not even going to recognize yourself. Like, you'll be reading about it, right? You'll be like, "Ooh, the belly of the beast. This sounds amazing. I wonder if it's that's about my neighborhood." What? I mean, it really does happen that way, and unfortunately, I think that happens a lot in print, because that headline writer, it seems to me, I don't know a lot about print, is disconnected from the journalist, right? So often they're there to find the clickable thing that is going to resonate. But even in cable and sometimes in broadcast too, this idea of boil it down and make it sexy and make it sell, which is then violence, crime, chaos, right? Those are the things, conflict. And it's so not nuanced and so just short-sighted, right? It's just like the most bottom feeder level of storytelling, I find, that it's disappointing. It's disheartening, frankly.
And I think
when we launched this newsroom, one of the things that we decided to do was, how are we going to not let this kind of stuff happen? You know, intention isn't enough. You actually have to kind of build it into your processes, because so much of what you guys are getting at is the processes of how news is made and the number of hands that can be involved in touching it. Sometimes those intentions go off the rail really fast. So we said, we've got to bake this into our DNA. How we started doing that was, you know, I said, we're not going to start with, you know, what's our newsroom going to be called and what's our website going to look like and where are we going to have a physical newsroom. We're not going to start there. Those decisions are going to come later. We're going to start by talking to Oakland residents and find out what they want journalism to do for Oakland. So we actually spent months in conversations with, small business owners, activists, healthcare workers, artists, students, educators. And we didn't use our language. We didn't say to them, what kind of news do you want? That's our language, right? We said, tell us about a time in the last year where something happened in your life. You were trying to achieve something here in Oakland, figure something out, and there was some piece of information you didn't have or perspective you didn't have access to. And it just made it harder to figure out what you were trying to figure out. And out of those conversations, we had 1,300 data points that we were looking at to say, what do Oaklanders want from journalism? And we created a set of founding values out of those conversations. And we heard things like, here's what we actually want journalism to do for Oakland. We want journalism that reflects the value of this city. So please don't just do the stories about what's not working, what's broken, what is, mired in corruption or, bureaucracy, or what is harming communities. There's a lot of power in our communities. We want your journalism to reflect that. And that decision led us, for instance, to create a position called Arts and Community Reporter. not just arts reporter, but arts and community reporter. This is somebody whose job is to go out there and tell the stories of what amazing nonprofits and organizers and just neighbors, are doing for each other, especially right now in the pandemic. And what we've heard over and over again from people in the last 12 months is it's her work, our community reporters' work, that has helped them feel more connected to Oakland in this time that is otherwise so disconnected. But I don't know that we would have made that decision to frame her work in that way, arts and community, we hadn't spent those months first talking to Oakland residents. So process matters. And I think that's so much of what you guys are both getting at. Definitions also matter. And as we're talking about equity in journalism, I'd love to hear from both of you what that means. Soledad, when you think of this term equity in journalism, like what does that mean to you?
I was going to ask you to define it because I think it means different things to different people. I mean, to me, equity just means what's fair on a lot of different fronts, right? What's fair in terms of how you're reflected, what's fair in terms of who tells your story, what's fair in terms of how much time your own voice gets to tell your story. When we started our show, Matter of Fact, which is a syndicated show, we began using a spreadsheet and saying, like, if we're going to have as our tagline, voices as diverse as America herself, then guess what? One of us should be measuring that. Like, I don't know, is it true? Because that might be good to know. And so we started, like, who's on the air? And it doesn't have to be people of color every single day, but somebody has to be saying, are we actually thinking about whose voice we elevate? And then the other thing that I think we did really intelligently was, if we're talking about farmers, then there should be a farmer in it. Right? Like, and that sounds so insane, but the number of times that people speak for people, elected officials will talk for their people versus, and this happens actually a lot in Indian reservations, right? Where someone speaks for Native Americans as if somehow you cannot find someone to come to the microphone and tell their story. And so we became very aggressive about, if we're going to talk about millennials who are not voting, find me a millennial who did not vote, because I want to ask her, why did you not vote? And also you can stack with that researchers, et cetera, et cetera. And it really has made our show much better. And our audience, I think, really responded to it as well. But to me, equity is just fairness. Who's around the table, and is what you're doing fair?
Mm-hmm. There's a phrase I like along those lines. It is, don't talk about us without us. And it sounds like, that's kind of what you're talking about. If you're going to do a story, include the people who, have the most at stake in that topic. Martin, how about you? How do you, at Maynard Institute, now you guys think about this day and night, how do you define equity in journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really thinking about having a seat at the table, being seen, being viewed as essential, having one's voice not simply as somehow exotified. And it's really, it's one of the things that is, when we've been talking about this whole diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, we really felt that the DEI discussion needed to be inverted. And this was even before the pandemic. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, was really EID, equity and inclusion in service of diversity. Because if you don't have equity, it doesn't really matter how much diversity you have, right? It's really performative. And so from my perspective, equity is one of the most essential components to really addressing, to not only telling the stories, but really addressing the problem that journalism is facing now. And I think, and even one step beyond that, to think beyond simply just inclusion, I know we'll get to that a little bit later, is this notion of belonging. Because I think you can include people, like you include your in-laws and the holidays, but you may not really want them to be there. Right. So if you include somebody, well, people can be included on a project, but doesn't mean that they feel as though they belong. When you belong, you can feel it in your bones. You can feel it in the equitable pay you receive. You can feel it being not the only one who is there. You can feel it in the language that you can use. You can feel it in the story angles that you're able to bring forth. You can feel it when you walk in the room, your perspective. You're not the only one that's having to speak for all of you. So there's a lot of things around equity relative to pay, relative to voice. And the other part I would say about what I think about equity is this notion of gaze, journalistic gaze, GACE. And my colleague, Michelle Garcia, really talked to me about this when we had a meeting when talked about how journalists of diverse backgrounds, folks of color, having to step into news organizations. And really what it was about was integration back in the day. It wasn't about really being able to bring your full self. So when I think about equity, it's also about being able to bring your full self, because the gazes of journalism in mainstream have been largely white, male, and middle class. And there's nothing wrong with that gaze. It's a perfectly legitimate gaze, but it's not the only gaze. There's a kaleidoscope of gazes that need to be there, and there needs to be equity within the journalistic process and within an organization for that to flourish.
Right. I think about it a lot in terms of who you listen to, who you allow to have feedback and input on your work. One thing that we have started is a program called Mission Metrics, which is our way of involving community feedback in what we're doing, not just at the beginning, not just when we launch the newsroom, but all the way through. How do you have a continuous feedback loop in which residents of communities that have not been traditionally well served or well represented in local newsrooms have influence, impact, input into the work that you're doing? We made a conscious decision that we're not going to have comments on our website, and it's something a lot of people ask us about. And why don't you have comments? And why can't I comment on your article? Well, who you comment, who you listen to, and who you make it easy for them to share their input with you, that is going to have an effect on your work, whether you realize it or not. And we know that we're going to get, some people who are more digitally plugged in, who are following us on our website, they're going to be the ones to comment. Well, that's not the only people we want to hear from. So we started this program where we actually work with and compensate for their time 7 Oakland community members, 1 from each city council district. And we intentionally sought out people who are not news junkies. They would never describe themselves that way. They actually weren't following the Oakland side. They're just people who reflect the diversity and the, in terms of age, racial and ethnic demographics, backgrounds, types of work, types of education that they're pursuing. They reflect Oakland's communities. And what we do is each week we send them 3 of our articles from the week before. And we have a whole series of questions like, did you find this valuable? Did you learn something from this? Did it help answer some kind of question for you? Was there anything in here that felt like a blind spot to you? Like, oh gosh, these guys don't know what they're talking about. And through that process, we're trying to keep this relationship going so that listening doesn't just happen once. Too often it doesn't happen at all. But it shouldn't just happen once. It's got to happen over and over again. So, I think equity is about who is in our newsrooms and also who our newsrooms are vulnerable to, in a way, if I could use that phrase. So I really appreciate both of you weighing in on that question of definitions. I think it's so important that we kind of set our definitions at the outset. I'd also love to hear from you a little bit more about why it matters whether or not a newsroom's demographics reflect the communities it covers. What's at stake? We've touched on this a little bit, especially, Soledad, with your experience in Oakland. I'd love to hear a little bit more, Martin, you were getting at, it's not just a numbers game, just kind of having, butts and chairs isn't enough. It's got to be more than that. How are we going to move the needle from just looking at diversity in terms of how many of X type of person do we have in our newsroom to this idea of belonging? Soledad, just love to hear any of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the conversation around, who's around the table, iteration 1.0 did count butts and chairs, right? But the actual thing is butts and chairs, and then what do they do? Are they just nodding, or are they saying, and sometimes uncomfortably, like, oh God, I have to weigh in again on the Black woman thing, oh God, which was always my role, like, oh God, I have to do this again. But part of the reason you get to be in the chair, in my mind at least, was like, you're there for a reason. And I'll tell you another story. We did a doc series for CNN called Latino in America. Probably 16, 20 people maybe around the table, and 2 Latinas, myself and my producer, Rose Arce, who works actually for my production company now. And it was very interesting. The producer, a guy who had been, was going to be the producer of the whole, I think it was going to be a 2 or 3 hour doc, sat down and told us what it was going to be and listed out one of the, all the different segments. One of the segments was going to be about me in some capacity because I was going to be hosting it, which I thought was utterly idiotic. Like, we have a very narrow, small opportunity to do a story about the Latino community, which is massive and diverse, right? Like, nobody loves me more than me, but let's not waste a segment on something about, like, we can tweet that. We don't need to, you know. So I remember thinking, like, this is ridiculous. Also, I don't do projects where I'm informed about what I'll be doing. Like, that's not what I do. And all 16 of us, like, who's around this table? Nobody who really knows very much about the community. And I wouldn't even, as a person who, my mother was Afro-Cuban, but I grew up in an all-white neighborhood in Long Island. Like, I wouldn't even put myself at the top of a list of people who are insanely knowledgeable about Latino or Latinx culture at all, you know? And so I think I'm somewhere like in the middle. And at some point we started arguing over, are there 48 million Latinos or is it 51? Because at 3 million in Puerto Rico, you know, do they count as American or not? And I'm like, we can just Google that. Like, it's insane to me that this is a conversation. And I laugh, but it was like terrifying, actually, because this is the group that's going to be doing this. And we're having a debate about something that's Googleable, and we're stuck here already. And it's an indication that this is not the right team. And I literally left that meeting and walked upstairs, and I was the anchor of it, right? So I actually wielded a fair amount of power. Went to the president of CNN and said, "You need to disband this group. It's not this. We're not doing this." And he did. He killed it, and we reframed it. But some of that, right, is being able to have the power and also the guts to say there are going to be repercussions. People generally don't love you when you do that. It does not make you the most popular girl in school. But at some point, you have to feel comfortable calling out BS and calling out these things that are culturally just wrong. I mean, I was being just completely self-protected, right? I knew if this early on, it's already a bit of a hot mess. Trust me, when we're in the scripting process, it's going to be bad. So for me, I need this to be a better group of people who have better insight into a community where they're the experts. And again, I'm somewhere in the middle, so I need to learn from them. And it was really disheartening. So I think you want a group of experts. Those can be people who are in the newsroom or people you're reaching out to. Like, who are we talking to? How are we coming to a meeting with our ideas solidified? Well, none of them even speak Spanish. I speak Spanglish. You know, Rose was the only fluent producer, and no one had asked her for any of her ideas, you know. And so it's butts and chairs, but also those same butts willing to stick their necks out and take some of those slings and arrows that come, because part of the problem when you're a bit of a squeaky wheel, it does not make people love you, and you have to be okay with being a squeaky wheel, or you shouldn't be around the table. You should give up your spot to somebody else. I think there's lots of people who are very comfortable around a table and say, well, you know, it's good enough. I don't want to upset the apple cart. I get it, but that's just never been me.
I mean, Martin, you know, one of the things that's so interesting to me about Oakland Voices is you are intentionally creating kind of a new table and inviting people to participate as community correspondents. So, you know, not necessarily people who are saying, I want to go be a journalist for the rest of my life. Like, I want to be a full-time writer. I want to be a full-time reporter. How are you thinking about the role that, you know, community correspondents through Oakland Voices can kind of disrupt our ideas of, you know, where the tables are and who gets to sit there?
Yeah. And I think it's really important. It's informed so much also about how Maynard actually does some of its other work. But the thinking really was that we actually didn't want people who were journalists. Because I think when people talk about community journalism, I think journalism is it's a craft, and I think anyone can learn to do it. But I think there are distinctions between storytelling and journalism, right? And I think they're really important distinctions, right? People talk about, well, now that we all have phones, anyone can be a journalist. No, it's not true. People can commit acts of journalism, but that doesn't make you a journalist, right? I think that journalism is about accountability. There's a place where you can go to say, hey, there's certain standards that have to be adhered to and followed at its best, right? There are codes of ethics. There are things that journalists do, practices that you follow. And those are important and essential. And then there's the role that community must play, has such an important role to play, and which is why we call them correspondents or community storytellers, and we explicitly wanted them to not sort of be mushed into capital J journalists, because we wanted the voices, we wanted the perspectives, the proximity to the stories to be different, right? Journalists have a tendency to sort of remove ourselves a bit from the story, and that's the notion of objectivity, which we can talk about later, which obviously they're objective facts, but they're not objective people. And so it was really essential to have, but we taught the folks journalism practices, but didn't expect them to then be journalistic in all of the way in which they approach the story, the community. Also because folks in community have a wealth of knowledge. They know so many things. And the problem that I often have with journalism organizations is that they don't see the value that folks often have. They've emphasized institutions over individuals, emphasizing sort of these institutions, which themselves are often systemically racist or biased. We give more credence and credibility to the quote from the sergeant than we will from somebody who saw something on the street. And I used to do that myself as a journalist, right? Well, because that individual has an obligation to be accurate who works for this institution. Well, we know that is not the case quite often. And so Oakland Voices is really about a combination of getting folks to tell stories that they feel are being untold, empowering them to do so with tools, and also building relationship, because we had a long time partnership with the Oakland Tribune, now with you all. But I think it's really important also that folks in the community do have a relationship with the journalistic institution that they are connected to, that's covering. There's so much that each can learn. And I think what the biggest takeaway that I've learned from Oakland Voices from these folks has been about the role that journalism organizations need to play. It needs to be much more shoulder to shoulder with communities and not us and them. And I think that is that we weren't necessarily taught that. When I bet Soledad, you look, who knows, you could be 25 years old. So no one really, it's just
sure.
No one knows, right? we were taught journalism in the same way.
Exactly.
Right? From that old school way of the story is here, the journalist is here. And I think there is such an opportunity to think differently about proximity. And I think that's something that I've learned deeply from doing this work with Oakland Voices.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have a program called Amplify Oakland where we work with, in a similar way to what y'all are doing at Oakland Voices. We work with people who have important stories to share, where they are the experts of their own experience, but are not people who are saying, I want to go be a journalist forever, or, I'm necessarily even written anything before in my life. And this is that space where we get to kind of do journalism that is not thinking about, truth or facts differently, but is allowing our newsroom to have a different relationship to the, topics that we're covering. And it's been very interesting to kind of navigate, I appreciated, Martin, you sort of saying, look, there are standards that we have to abide by, and some of our journalism is going to look different from, other kinds of our journalism. One good example of this is, and you brought up, this issue of sourcing, especially around topics of law enforcement accountability. One of the things we heard loud and clear during our community listening process was an appetite for more reporting in Oakland on policing, as opposed to the traditional local media focus on crime, a focus in which we all know, as you were alluding to, Martin, law enforcement officials are often afforded immense power to shape the narrative and influence perception of what did or did not happen in interactions between police officers and residents. And, Oakland, of course, has played an incredibly important role in this national conversation and this national public awareness of problems of police violence, with the killing of Oscar Grant in 2009, and the role that bystander video played in our understanding of what happened that morning. Soledad, you've deeply explored police violence and other harms that are disproportionately faced by Black Americans through your independent production company. And I'm wondering what is different about the approach that you're taking or are able to take as an independent journalist, as opposed to when you were working with, solely under the banner of a legacy media platform like a CNN or an NBC.
I think there's just been a shift, even if you are working under a legacy banner, because I think, as Martin pointed out, this conversation about objectivity has really, especially with the Washington Post kind of at the center of it in the bad way, this idea of like, well, what does it exactly mean to be objective? Because I think for a lot of executives, objective means we're middle-aged white dudes and you should agree with our point of view, which we all believe is a very rational point of view. I mean, that's kind of, like that's what your point of view should be. And I do think this conversation, so I think it's shifted a lot. And I think Martin talks about how we used to give this credibility. I mean, when I worked in Oakland, right, we would do, or the East Bay, the police would let you know about the perp walk. You guys, I don't know if you did it in video, but we would be told if you went to the station at a certain time, right, they would take a person who'd already been booked. There was no reason for him to be walked outside. But if I wanted to report on Jonathan Edward Smith III has been arrested for a series of blah, 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 I need about 10 seconds of video. So, wow, what an amazing, thank you so much to walk him around the building from the one door to the other door, because that gives me about 9.5 seconds. So now I can cover it, and with his face. Right? I didn't capture it. I didn't happen upon it while it was happening. And by the way, why would you be walking the person around the building? I mean, and I was young. Like I did not question it. I actually was incredibly grateful. Thank you for walking the dude. I now have my opening 9.5 seconds of video. And that's not unusual, right? That perp walk, which is done very intentionally. I'm going to help you, and you're going to kind of sort of help me, because you're going to put this person who's now our suspect, you're going to make him front and center in the news. And so I think we've started having those conversations about, well, what is objective? And whose version of the story, once you see that certain people lie consistently, you start realizing that maybe we can't give full credence to the police story all the time, because we now know over many, many, many examples that people will just make stuff up if they're an interested party in the story in some capacity. Obviously, not a shocker, but it did take us quite a long time to get there. And sometimes the only reason we got there is because the video would be released and we'd all say like, wow, it's completely different than the statement that said the person tripped over his shoelace and somehow died, right? And so I think that conversation about objectivity is really, really, really important. But I think it's shifted for everybody. I don't think because we're independent, when we sell to big organizations. So I don't think it's because we're independent that conversation has changed. I think that conversation has just changed.
Right. Martin, how, with the Maynard Institute, you guys are kind of at the front lines of sometimes pulling newsrooms along, kicking and screaming at times to sort of say, hey, see how there's some things that we used to do, that we used to take, as kind of our gold standard them anymore? What are the areas that you are next in terms of stop doing something that they've been doing for a long time?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna piggyback real quick on what Soledad said real fast, particularly about Oakland. I want to correct one thing, is that I was a lead editor on the Chauncey Bailey project, not the lead editor. I don't want to have my colleagues coming
call you up tonight.
You know what you said. Well, you didn't check it. So I was among.
Thank you for the fact check.
No, it's all good. It's all good. And I think what really stood out to me about that particular time when Chauncey Bailey happened, and other things that we learned about the police department and all the challenges that Oakland has faced, whether it's with its public schools or with its police department, and the consent decree that it seems like it has been under in perpetuity, was at the time of the Chauncey Bailey Project, which was formed to investigate the slaying of Oakland Post editor and former Oakland Tribune reporter Chauncey Bailey by the Bay family, or members of the Bay family, Yusuf Bay and proxies, was that there were more investigators investigating wrongdoing on the part of the police department than were investigating homicides in the city. I mean, think about that for a minute. There were more investigators investigating the police department itself via the consent decree than there were homicide investigators investigating homicides in the city of Oakland. I mean, I just think that really speaks volumes to the challenges and to how over time this narrative has shifted from this authoritative institution to really needing as journalists to question it. And to answer your question about sort of what are the things that we are wanting to see news organizations stop doing and begin doing, one of the things is really rethinking crime coverage. There have been a number of news organizations that have stopped running mugshots and mugshot arrays that are stopping covering arrests. Like if you're not going to cover an arrest unless you're going to cover the case, right? Because there has been this overemphasis of coverage of crime, and who is disproportionately reflected in coverage of crime? Black and brown folks and indigenous folks. And so there is a real need to really rethink, and I think a lot of this has had to do with what is our journalistic value system, which is why I've liked, and I give an example when we do training oftentimes of Oaklandside's mission metrics, because I think journalism organizations, particularly for-profit journalism organizations that knew and were complicit in understanding crime drives audience drives revenue, that really made some decisions, right? That we are going to emphasize this because we know it sells. Now, I'm not saying the journalists on staff were doing that, but it was an institutional decision, and it also was an institutional norm. But that really, that value system, what are we about? What are we for? And why are we doing this? And so I'm really pleased to see a number of news organizations, if you're going to cover something and you're going to cover an arrest, cover the case from gavel to gavel. And also, why are you doing that, right? What is the reason? The other thing I think that what's really vital for news organizations to do as we're talking about having this conversation about, well, why does diversity matter? It's really, I'm sort of over this whole notion of, journalists should be inclusive because there's some sort of the integrity of that, the need of that. I mean, yes, that is true, but I would much rather the reason for diversity to matter to be tethered to credibility, trust, and sustainability. Because otherwise, if it's just that journalists have an obligation, that hasn't worked. And as much as I would like the sort of the reason why, because of that it's the right thing to do to matter, when stuff hits the fan, things that are a nice to have go away.
Right.
And there's always a crisis in journalism because there's always the news, right? And there's always the financial side, all of these factors. So what we're really pushing news organizations to tether why this stuff should matter is because we have a huge trust gap in how the public perceives media. And we know from the Trust Project run by Sally Lehrman that diverse voices equate to trust in the eyes of news consumers. And the reality is, I want folks to tie this to sustainability. What are the demographics of the country shifting? More and more people of color. So tie it to sustainability, tie it to trust, tie it to audience, connect it to as a strategic pillar for the organization, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, and then this can stick. And so that's the narrative that we're really sharing now. And it's liberating. And the last point, and I'll end on this, and it's been a long answer, is that the conversation has shifted from mere diversity to actually dismantling systemic racism in news and decentering white supremacy culture. That's new. In terms of that explicit language, we weren't having those conversations with major news organizations just 18 months ago. We were sort of dancing around it with objectivity and bias. Now it's explicit, and that's important, essential, and new.
May I add a couple of things to that list? I'd like reporters to use actual words that they would actually use, right? When people say it was racially tinged, I'm like, literally, what the F does that mean? Literally, I just explained that word. Like, when have you ever said that in your life? When have you ever said it looks like it was foul play? What does that mean? It's not a thing. Nobody's ever said, I don't know, looks like foul play. I mean, and so sometimes you have, I don't know why we bump up against these institutional norms, as you call them, right? That have just become this, I think, a little bit lazy shorthand for someone who doesn't want to no, go back and tell me the word you're actually trying to use. What are you trying to say? Whenever I get stuck in writing, I'm always like, what am I trying to say? And I'll write the messiest, most convoluted, terrible sentence, but at least it's what I'm trying to say, and then I can work from there, versus these little shorthands that mean nothing. Because I think sometimes we pass along, honestly, lots of things that are based in racism and white supremacy just because they're shorthand. They're just the way we've always done it. And I would like to also lose this idea of both sides. And then we ask this person, as if someone gets to weigh in on someone's experience all the time. It doesn't have to be the case. And really educating newsrooms that, sometimes you can just have stories with experts. We don't have the flat earth guy on every time we talk about what NASA's doing. We don't say, but there are some people who don't believe the earth is round. Who knows if that satellite's actually going to go up? Let's check in with Bill, our flat earth guy. We don't do it because we recognize that there are certain things that we don't have to check in, and removing that both sides. And I will say right now, the New York Times is horrible at it. And I wish that they would get better at recognizing that they don't have to do this versus that, because it undermines and undercuts the power in anything that they're working on. And then finally, I agree with you at this idea of diversity, kumbaya, it's good for everybody, versus listen, everybody finds that Black reporter when they need to get into a community that they don't know. Everybody finds the Asian reporter when all of a sudden the head story is about Asians, and they're like, get me, who do we have? And sometimes it might even be the intern. Is she fluent in Korean? Fantastic. Put her in with the reporter, right? Because they recognize the value of that person's expertise. Yeah. Suddenly it rises to the fore. And I'd like to see that every day, and not just when there's a breaking news story, but recognizing that these are communities where things are happening all the time. We just don't bother necessarily to cover it. So those are the things that I would just kind of add to that list, maybe.
Well, I think that's an incredibly powerful note to end on. I would like to thank my guests, Soledad O'Brien and Martin G. Reynolds, for lending their voices, their insights, and their experience to this conversation. Thank you both.
Pleasure.
And I'd like to thank all of you for caring about local journalism, who journalism is serving, and what it can do for communities like the ones we have here in Oakland to help make sure that everyone has access to the information and perspectives and voices that they need to be informed, healthy, and empowered. I'm Tasneem Raja. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Oaklandside, and I hope you'll tune in to more great conversations throughout the next 2 days at Oaklandside Live-ish next year. Oaklandside Live, fingers crossed. And if you're not already, I hope you'll become a member of the Oaklandside to power more great local journalism by and for Oakland residents. Thank you.